How do you like the dress I found? Or I think it should be called a uniform. And I'm quite sure that this was meant to be worn with it on the head. Do you know what the person did who wore this uniform? She was a nurse, and I would guess maybe back in about the 1920s. You know, when I think of nursing, there is one woman in particular who stands out in my mind as being truly remarkable. Her name was Clara Barton, and here is a picture of her as a grown woman. Would you like to find out more about Clara Barton and why I think she was so special? Would you like to know why she decided to become a nurse? Well, let's go back to when Clara was a little girl. Clara was 12 years younger than any of her brothers or sisters, and when they were at school, she missed them. She had to play all alone on the Barton farm in Massachusetts. In warm weather, she played on the wide front step, played tea party with Buttons the dog as her only guest. In the winter, Clara played in the big kitchen where she could watch her mother cook and bake and sew. Clara's two older sisters were teachers. They taught Clara to read before she was old enough to go to school. She was not so lonely when she could read storybooks to herself. Clara's older brother, Stephen, was an arithmetic teacher. He showed Clara how to add and subtract numbers on her slate. David was another of Clara's brothers. He gave her a very different kind of lesson. He loved horses and the outdoors. He gave Clara horseback riding lessons. He taught her to ride bareback. Oh, the two would gallop over the fields, holding on to their horses' manes. Clara's father had been a captain in the French and Indian wars. He lined up toy soldiers on the parlor floor, and he showed Clara how soldiers fought battles. He told her stories about wars and battles, and Clara liked this best of all. Once, she even told her father that she wished she could be a soldier. When Clara was 11 years old, something happened that changed her whole life. It began when her father decided he needed a new barn. Clara's brothers and the neighbors helped build the barn. Clara watched the men working. She watched her brother David as he stood at the top of the new barn, and she thought how brave he looked, standing so high above the ground. Oh, but suddenly a board broke and David fell crashing to the ground. Everyone ran to help. Bravely, David stood up and said that he was not hurt. Oh, but later that night his head began to ache and he had a very high fever. When the doctor came, Clara and her mother waited outside the door.
Poor boy, he is in such pain. He won't let anyone come near him.
Please, Mother, let me see David. Let me try to help him.
All right, child, but only for a few minutes.
Clara went into David's room. He had always been so strong. Now he lay still. His face was white. His eyes were closed. The doctor was afraid David would die. But Clara was sure she could make him well. She begged to be his nurse. The doctor showed Clara how to give David his medicine and take care of him. For months, Clara worked day and night to help her brother get well. No matter how sick David was, Clara never lost hope.
I won't give up. You will get well. I know you will.
The only playing Clara did during David's illness was to go for short rides on her horse. Her older sisters helped her with her schoolwork at home. Oh, it was a wonderful day for Clara when David was finally able to walk out of his room. Smiling, David told everyone,
"It was my little nurse who made me get well."
The doctor agreed. He told Clara's mother and father that she was a natural nurse. Well, now that David was well, Clara had a new wish. She hoped that when she was grown up, she could help other people as she had helped David, and that wish became the most important thing in her life. Several years later, Clara decided to become a teacher. That was a way to help others, she thought. So Clara put up her hair and lengthened her skirts. She was only in her teens and still very small for her age. She wanted to look older when she took her first job. In those days, people did not have to have special training to become teachers, so Clara had to teach her first class without anyone ever having told her just what to do. Oh, she was so frightened the first day of school. Why, some of the boys in the class were even bigger than she was. Oh, but she got through that first day, and the next, and the next. Clara found she enjoyed teaching school. She made her children enjoy school, too. Clara became known as a fine teacher. She worked very hard at her job. As time went on, she became very tired. One morning, she found she could not talk. She could only whisper. A doctor told Clara that she had been working too hard. She must take a long rest. Clara decided to go to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, for a change and a rest. Oh, but she was not still for long. She soon grew tired of resting. Clara found a job in Washington. Why, she was one of the first women to work in a government office. In her free time, Clara went to hear the speakers in Congress. At this time, the congressmen from the North and the South were not able to agree about many important matters. Most of all, they argued about the right to own slaves. Finally, in 1861, a war between the northern states and the southern states began. It was the Civil War. After the battle started, many of the wounded soldiers were sent back to Washington, D.C. Some wounded soldiers were taken care of in hospital tents near the battle lines, but most of them waited days to be helped. Some were brought many miles in wagons over rough roads. On the long journey to the hospitals, the wounded men had no medicine to help their pain. There were no nurses to take care of them. Many times they had no food. How badly they needed someone to nurse them. Clara remembered what she had said to her father when she was a little girl, that she wished she could be a soldier. Now, Clara Barton had an idea.
If I can't be a soldier, I want to help soldiers. I can be a new kind of soldier. There is no one on the battlefields to help the wounded men, and often there are not enough medicines or bandages. The men would have a better chance of getting well if they could get help sooner.
Clara started writing letters. She wrote to friends and relatives. She asked them for money to buy supplies of food and medicine. Her friends and relatives were very generous. Soon, Clara had a warehouse of blankets and bandages and food. Clara went to see some generals of the Northern Army. She asked them to let her go to the battlefront.
Give me a chance. Let me go to the battlefields. I can keep many of your men from dying.
The generals did not think the battlefield was the right place for a woman.
No woman would know what to do in war.
Clara remembered her father's stories of his army days.
I will know what to do. Just let me go.
At last, a general said to Clara,
Our wounded men do need help on the battlefield, Miss Barton. I guess you are the one to give it to them. We will give you a wagon for your supplies.
Later, the Northern Army gave Clara money for more supplies. But they even gave her a whole train of army wagons and men to load them. At last, her wish to help others had really come true. On one of her trips to the battlefront, Clara saw the most dreadful sight she had ever seen. There were 3,000 wounded men lying on the bare ground, waiting for help, her help. Without a moment's delay, she began building a fire, preparing food, bandaging wounds, but she seemed to be everywhere at once. She worked all day and through the night. When daylight came, a young officer rode up. He pointed to a cloud of cannon smoke.
The enemy will soon be here, Miss Barton. You will not be safe here when the fighting starts. Please, leave at once.
Clara saw some wounded men still waiting to be put in wagons.
There are men here who need me. I cannot go yet.
Clara hurried to finish her work. She saw that all the men were put into wagons or on the train. They would be taken to hospitals. Then the young officer came back.
Hurry, Miss Barton. Take my horse and ride to the train. If you ride fast, you can still get on it.
The horse bucked and reared, but Clara held on tightly. Her horse galloped to the train that was already moving down the track. A man on the train saw Clara. He held out his hand and shouted for her to jump. Clara kicked her feet free. She reached for the man's hand and jumped to the train. Clara sank onto a train seat with a sigh of relief. None of the wounded soldiers had been left behind. They were safe. She had escaped and was safe too. To herself she whispered,
Bless David for teaching me how to ride.
About 4 years after the Civil War, Clara made a trip to the country of Switzerland. There, she learned about a group or organization called the Red Cross. It had been started so that wounded soldiers could get help, the kind of help she had given during the Civil War. When Clara returned to America, she tried to get people in Washington interested in our country joining the Red Cross. She made speeches, but since we were not at war, few people could see a need for such an organization. Clara told people,
Our country is at peace. We pray it always will be. But even in peacetime, there are enemies to fight all over the world. The enemies of nature, floods and fires, earthquakes, hunger and sickness.
At last, in 1882, the United States joined other countries in the Red Cross. Clara Barton was made the first president of the American Red Cross, and for 22 years, until she was 83 years old, Clara traveled all over the United States and many other countries too. She went wherever the help of the Red Cross was needed. The memory of Clara Barton still shines through the whole world today, and wherever the Red Cross flag flies, the spirit of Clara Barton flies with it. What we heard today came from this book, Clara Barton, Soldier of Mercy by Mary Rose. Will you think of Clara the next time you see or hear something about the Red Cross? I know I will. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.
time Abraham Lincoln became president, there had been a great many changes in our country. Men had invented many new things, and one of those inventions was an engine to pull trains. Oh, it was very different from the train engines of today. It had a tall black smokestack, and it could not go much more than 20 miles an hour. But that was farther in 1 hour than a covered wagon could go in a day. So every year more and more miles of track were laid. But there was even talk of building a railroad that would go all the way across our country to California. But most people said that was nonsense. Buffaloes would block the way. Indians would attack. And what about the high mountains and the desert? Why, you couldn't lay track there. Abraham Lincoln thought differently. After he was made president, he signed a paper that said a Transcontinental Railroad was to be started. Now, the word trans means across, so transcontinental means across the whole width of our country, across the continent. Two companies were to build the railroad. One company was to start building west from the Missouri River. The other company was to start building east from California. When the two tracks met, the railway would be done. Most of the men who started work at the Missouri River had come to this country from Ireland. Most of the men who started work in California came from a very different part of the world. They wore loose blue suits and straw hats. They had pigtails down their backs. They came from the great land of China. Now, a boy named Mike and his father had come from Ireland. After Mike's mother had died, his father had sold their farm in Ireland, and he got just enough money to bring the two of them to America. Now they were working on the railroad. Mike's father was boss of his rail gang. Mike himself was a water boy. He carried water to the thirsty men. Mike's hair was red. His eyes were as blue as the lakes in Ireland. But now his eyes were frowning, and they looked dark as thunderclouds. He had carried so much water that his back ached and his hands hurt. He set his pails down for a minute to rest. A loud, angry shout came. "Hi there, boy, water!" Mike grabbed up his pails. Water was precious in this desert land where the men were working now, so Mike hurried carefully to the men with his pails. Each day, trains brought up supplies. As soon as new tracks were laid, the engines began running over them. Each day the engines could go a little farther before they came to end of track, as the men called it. Sometimes a mile of track was laid in a day, sometimes 2 miles, sometimes even more. The trains brought up railway ties and iron rails, spikes and bolts. They brought up all the food for the men and hay for the horses. Now, end of track was in the desert, and the train had to bring water as well. The air was always full of noise. Wagons pounded past, men shouted, hammers clanged as the men drove spikes in. Oh, suddenly there was another sound. It was right behind Mike. It was the thud of hoofs. There was a shout, and Mike jumped aside. A big horse went galloping by. A boy rode on the horse's back, and he was shouting at people to get out of the way. The horse galloped down the track. Behind the horse was a long rope fastened to a rail truck that was bringing up more rails for the men at end of track. Mike watched the horse. Oh, how Mike longed to ride such an animal. Oh, but there was no horse for Mike. On he plodded down the path with his pails. Now the day's work was nearly done. No more water was needed. Mike went over to watch his father's gang before they stopped work. There were a few more rails to lay. The men worked fast. It took just half a minute to lay a rail. 2 rails a minute. The end of track moved forward. Nearer and nearer together came the 2 lines of track. Now, A race began between the Irish and the Chinese workers to see who could lay the most track in a day. Oh, the men were eager and excited. The Irish worked hard to beat the Chinese. The Chinese worked hard to beat the Irish. The Irish had done their share of hard work. They had laid track over mountains and across the desert under burning sun. They had had to fight Indians. Oh, but the Chinese, too, had had their share of hardship. But in the mountains they had to cross, there were some places where the cliffs dropped straight down for 2,000 feet. There was no place for track. A shelf had to be cut into the side of the mountain. The Chinese workers were let down by ropes. There they hung over the cliffs. They chipped the rock away by hand. Oh, what would happen if the ropes broke? But that was not all. The Chinese had cut tunnels through the mountains. They had blasted away the rock with gunpowder, and that was very dangerous. The men had to light the gunpowder and then run. Sometimes they could not run fast enough. Mike wondered about these Chinese. They were strangers. They were different. He wasn't sure he liked them. Once Mike had seen some of them driving a supply wagon. A boy about his own age was in the wagon. The Irish boys had laughed at the Chinese boy. They'd pointed at his straw hat and his pigtail. But the Chinese boy had paid no attention to them. At last, news came that made every Irishman sit up. Each day, the workers on both sides had been trying to lay a little more track than the day before. Now came news. The Chinese had laid 6 miles of track in one day. Never had there been such a record. Oh, Mike heard the men around him mutter, "We'll show them." Never had the work gone so quickly as it did the next day. Rail trucks thundered along, hammers clanged. Mike raced back and forth with his water buckets. During the day, word came in. 4 miles had been finished, then 5 miles, then 6. Oh, everyone cheered. They would break the record the Chinese had set. Then something unexpected happened. Mike was hurrying along the path. A rail truck came pounding down the track. The big horse was galloping by. Suddenly, the animal stumbled, and the boy riding him went flying over the horse's head. The boy lay on the ground, and the horse stopped. Mike ran to the boy and knelt beside him. He asked if the boy was badly hurt. The boy opened his eyes. Then he began to shout at Mike to get on with the load of rails. The rails must get on to the end of track, and quickly. For half a second, Mike looked at the boy. Then he grinned, his eyes flashed blue, and in a second he was on the horse. "Giddy up!" shouted Mike. And the horse broke into a gallop. Mike bounced up and down. First he thought he'd be bounced to bits, but he held on for dear life. Down the track galloped the horse with the truck following along behind. The men who were waiting were angry. They did not look to see who was on the horse. One worker shouted, "Where have you been, boy?" Mike had no time to explain. He just stopped his horse fast. Then Mike's father saw who was riding the horse, and he shouted to his son, "Good work! Keep those rails a-comin'." When the truck was empty, back down the path rode Mike. He bounced about less now. He was getting used to the horse, and for the rest of the day, Mike rode proudly back and forth along the track. That night, there was good news. 7.5 miles of track had been laid. Oh, there were cheers and celebrations. But not for long. Word came from the other side. The Chinese boasted that the next day they would lay 10 miles of track. 10 miles in one day. Impossible. The railway was nearly finished now. The tracks were coming very close together. In fact, they were so close, it was decided to give the Irish workers a holiday to go to see the fun. 10 miles in a day? Impossible. Mike was up before daybreak. He rode across the desert with his father and a group of the other men in a big wagon. At 7 o'clock, the signal for the Chinese to start work was given. Mike's eyes opened wide. Never had he seen men work so fast. 15 seconds and a rail was down. By noon, 6 miles were down. By 7 o'clock that night, 10 miles were done. The Irish went grumbling back to their camp. The record was broken. And what was worse, there was nothing they could do about it. The railway was too nearly finished. There were only 6 miles of track left to be laid. Mike muttered to himself that it wasn't fair. He was sure the Irish could have beaten the Chinese if they'd only had the chance. He almost hated those Chinese. There was a great celebration when the last rails were laid on May 10th, 1869. The place where the two tracks met was in the state of Utah, near the Great Salt Lake. Trains came up on the tracks from both directions. They brought crowds of men in high silk hats. They brought ladies in long silk dresses. There were people from every part of our country. At last, everything was ready. 2 engines stood facing each other. Then, the last pair of rails was laid between them. A band played. There were speeches. Then, a gentleman lifted a big hammer. He drove in the last spike in the Transcontinental Railroad, and that spike was made of pure gold. The 2 engines steamed forward until they touched. The people clapped and shouted and threw their caps into the air. The whistles on the engines blew until Mike thought his ears would burst. Bells began to ring. Men fired their guns into the air. Oh, Mike was screaming as loud as anyone. He was jumping up and down. Suddenly, he saw that he was beside the Chinese boy. Mike forgot that he did not like the Chinese. Before he knew it, the two were clapping each other on the back. They were laughing and shouting together. The 2 boys could not talk together, but they grinned. They were no longer 2 strangers from 2 very different lands. They had both worked on the great Transcontinental Railroad. They were both Americans. And that was the story of the Transcontinental Railroad from this book, Pioneer Children of America by Carolyn Emerson. Little by little, our country changed from a land of covered wagons and log cabins to one of factories and railways and machinery. It's not, however, the factories and the engines that make a country great. It's the people who live and work there. And men and women and children from almost every land in the world have helped to make this country what it is today. You are going to go right on finding new ways to make it even better. I count on that. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. Have a very special visitor with us in the attic today. My friend Cowboy Jim.
Howdy.
I asked Jim to join us because, well, frankly, I don't know very much about cowboys and the early days of cowpunching.
And I hoped he might be able to tell us something about that part of America's past.
I sure would like to. And there's one cowboy in particular that I think you should know about. A fellow by the name of Pecos Bill. He was known all the way from Texas to California for his bravery and his inventions, and for the way he looked. I guess if we've ever had any giants in America, Pecos Bill was one of them.
What do you mean he was a giant? Was he big?
Was he big? You ask any cowpuncher if Pecos Bill was big.
Well, but how big? I mean, tall as a real giant and strong?
Oh, shucks, yes. Why, he was easy 12 feet high and strong enough so that he could rope a couple of miles of railroad track just like it was a little keg.
Weren't people afraid of him?
Only the outlaws and the robbers. They were plenty scared. But decent folks never had a better friend. And the cowboys, well, he put us on the map.
How? You tell us what he did.
Well, no two cowpunchers tell his story just alike, but I'll tell you what they say down in Texas, where I come from. Bill's folks were pioneers. They liked the wide open country, and when the neighborhood began to get crowded, well, they'd just pack up their wagon and move on. Now, Bill was just a little fella. Some say he was just a baby, but most folks agree he was about 4 when his ma met his pa at the cabin door one night and...
Pa? Oh, Pa?
What is it, Ma? That old rattlesnake been bothering you again?
Worse than that. We got to move.
What for? We just got this place fixed up with prospects of a good crop come fall.
It's the same old thing, Pa. Neighbors.
Again? How close?
Close enough to make it crowded. 50 miles from here this time. Next thing we know, it'll be 25. And after that, we'll see smoke rising when they start their fires. Might as well move into town.
Well, I guess you're right. You get the children ready, and I'll pack up the wagon. We'll cross the Pecos River heading west. But before we set out this time, I want my supper.
It's waiting for you, Pa. You come inside and we'll make plans while you eat.
And that's when Bill got separated from his family. That time they were pushing on through Texas, heading west. You see, they piled that wagon so high that little Bill, who was hanging on the back, bounced off just after they crossed the Pecos River. His family didn't miss him for 3 days. They had so many children. And by the time they found out, it was too late. You see, he'd been taken in by a mother coyote and made a member of the pack. Some say he stayed with them till he was grown. But at any rate, he stayed with them long enough to learn their language, as well as the language of all the other animals. And what's more, he didn't know that he was a boy. Now, the way he found out he was a boy was, one day he met a cowboy.
Howdy, stranger. I said howdy. You live out here in these wild parts? That's pretty good. You know, I'd sworn it was a real coyote if I hadn't seen you do it. What is it? Don't you talk?
Talk?
Yes, talk. Like this. Talk.
Talk.
You mean you talk like a coyote?
Talk.
But you're not a coyote. You're a man. Like me. A man. You have 2 arms, 2 feet, a face. Say, you got any clothes? Like the stuff I'm wearing?
No clothes.
But that doesn't mean that you're a coyote. The Indians don't wear clothes like these, but they're men. Look here. You haven't got 2 pointed ears, or a long, sharp nose, or a tail.
No long ears, no long nose, no tail.
You see, you're not a coyote. You're a man. I tell you what, you come back with me to camp, I'll teach you to talk, And if you don't want to join the human race, I'll eat my hat.
Now, Bill was smart. By the time he got to camp that night, he'd learned how to talk. And he told them all about his being a coyote since he was a little fella. And when he told them it was the Pecos River where he'd been lost, the men decided to call him Pecos Bill.
Did he ever go back to the coyotes?
Well, not to stay. You see, he'd joined the human race. But he never forgot how to talk to animals, which was a very handy thing in the West in those days. Bill was a friend to every living creature, wild or tame, and they were friends with him.
Now, what about his inventions? You said he was smart, and he must have been to have learned to talk in one day. But what did he invent that was so wonderful?
Well, quite a lot of things that cowboys use. You see, Bill lived in different camps. All the camps wanted him because he was so big and strong, and also because he had ideas on how to do things better. For example, all of you probably know what barbed wire is. Well, I bet you didn't know that Pecos Bill invented it. You see, in the West in those days, they didn't have stones to build walls to keep the cattle in. So Bill, he just tied little bitty pieces of wire around a long piece, and there it was, a fence. Yes, sirree. Pecos Bill invented barbed wire and a lot of other things like, well, one day he was walking in the corral of the XL Ranch and thinking.
This being a man is fine, in lots of ways. Good food every day, soft beds at night, other men to talk to. But there's something wrong. Something that didn't bother me when I was a coyote. It's time. There's too much time spent doing nothing. Hey, Joe.
What do you want, Bill? What's up?
Joe, how do you go about bringing in a steer?
Why, like everybody else does, I guess. Put the rope down on the ground, and then set a spell, and wait for a steer to step into it.
Takes a long time, don't it?
Well, you can't hurry up a steer when he's got all of Texas for a pasture.
I got a better idea. One that'll bring in 200 steers while you're waiting for one. Look.
Bill picked up a rope, coiled it, aimed it, and threw it.
There. If there'd been a steer running by, that would have caught him right around the neck. And you know, you could even throw it from a horse.
Think of doing all that with a little old piece of rope. There ought to be a name for it.
We'll call it a lariat.
And it's been called a lariat ever since. Now, Pecos Bill worked out a lot of other ideas, too, that made cow punching the biggest business in the West. Instead of just a few steers each year, why, hundreds and thousands of cattle began to be handled by the Western ranches. And Bill invented the ways and the words for doing it.
So when we go out on the range and lasso them with our lariats, we'll call it rounding them up.
Rounding them up.
Then after we bring them back here, we herd them.
Herd them.
But I've got another idea. No corral's going to be big enough to keep all these cattle in.
Just what I've been thinking. So what's the use of our working so hard to get them?
Look, there's a piece of metal. Somebody take it to the kitchen and heat it up. Red hot. Somebody else fetch me a steer. I'm going to take that piece of metal and brand the steer with it.
Brand him.
But it'll leave a mark.
Sure it will. That's what it's for. This here's the XL Ranch. If we brand our cattle XL and turn them loose, anybody that sees them will know that they come from here. That way we don't have to worry about keeping them fenced in. We simply ride the open range to round them up.
Sounds like a good idea. Not as much trouble as the old way.
Here's a critter for you, Bill. And here's the branding iron. Look out, it's hot.
Someone hold his horns while I grab his tail. There. Don't hurt him any more than a bee sting. And now he's free to run where he likes.
And from that day to this, cattle have been branded and cowboys have been riding the range.
But whatever happened to Bill? Did he always stay a cowboy? Did he ever get married and settle down?
Oh, he kept on being a cowboy, all right. Fact is, his business got so big that while he lived in Texas, he had to use New Mexico for a corral and Arizona for a pasture. About that time, though, he met a gal that caught his eye. She could ride a horse like any man, and she had ideas big as Bill.
What was her name?
Sue. Sweet Sue, or Slewfoot Sue. Red-haired and pretty as a picture. Only trouble they ever had was on their wedding day.
No, Sue. That's the only thing you mustn't ever do. That white horse of mine is wild. No man has ever been able to stay on him for more than 2 minutes at a time. You can ride any other horse in the West, but stay away from Widowmaker.
Why do you call him Widowmaker?
Because he's made a widow of the wife of every man that's tried to ride him. Do you promise?
Maybe.
Come on, Sue. Promise.
We'll see. I'll tell you later.
And away she ran. Well, you can guess what happened. The next thing Bill knew, Sweet Sue had jumped on Widowmaker.
Well, could she ride him?
Well, not for more than 2 minutes, just like Bill said. That white horse, he reared up and he threw her up to the moon. Some say that she stayed right where she lit. Others say she ran away and was never heard from again. But down in Texas, where I come from, they tell how she fell, and she landed on her bustle, and she bounced and bounced and bounced till Bill came by and picked her up.
Did she ever try to ride Widowmaker again?
Not as long as she lived. I guess she figured Bill knew best.
Well, now, is that all there is to tell about Pecos Bill?
Oh, I should say not. There's a lot more to tell, only we don't have time for me to finish it today. But the main thing to remember is Pecos Bill was a giant. Not just because he was tall and strong. Bill was a giant because he had big ideas. The cowboys owe more to Pecos Bill than to anybody else in the West.
I guess so. Would you have liked to have been a cowboy back in the days of the early West? It was hard work, but it sounds exciting and fun, doesn't it? You know, I'm very happy that we had this cowboy with us today. I thank you so much for telling us about Pecos Bill.
Well, thank you, ma'am. It was my pleasure.
And you know, it's going to be a real pleasure for me when you come back to share another story in the attic. I'll see you then. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. I'm sure that you have noticed this old lamp in my attic. I wonder when it was used last. I wonder if it would work now if we plugged it in. As old as it looks, we must remember that there was a time when there were no electric lights. Why, if you wanted to be able to see at night or On a dark day, you had to depend on candlelight, or perhaps light from a fire, or maybe light from a smelly kerosene lantern like this one. All that was changed by a person that we know as Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison was born over 100 years ago in this house in Milan, Ohio. He was born on February 11th, 1847. At that time, in America, in fact, in all the world, there were no radios, no telephones, no automobiles, no movies. In all the world, there was not one electric light. When Tom was little, he began asking questions just about as soon as he could talk. But he was not always happy with other people's answers. So, when he grew up, he worked out his own answers. And the special answers of Thomas Alva Edison were inventions. Perhaps his most important invention was the one that pushed back the dark, the electric light. When Tom was only 4, he noticed something odd in the barn. He noticed that the family goose always sat on her eggs. Tom asked his mother,
"Why does our goose sit on the eggs, Mother?"
Because she wants to keep them warm.
But why?
Because they will hatch if they stay warm.
But what does hatch mean?
Hatch means coming out of an egg, Tom. It means being born for a baby goose.
Mrs. Edison picked up an egg.
See how warm it is? When it is ready, a baby goose will come out of this shell.
The eggs have to be warm to hatch?
That's right, Tom.
Then gently, Mrs. Edison put the egg back in the nest. That night, Tom's family was worried about him. They had not seen him for hours. His mother and father and his older sister Tanny looked all through the house for him. They looked in the yard. Then they looked in the barn, and there was Tom, curled up on a nest. Tom's father shouted,
"What are you doing, Tom Edison?"
Tom had an answer ready. He was hatching eggs. He was making baby geese. His sister Tanny burst out laughing.
You're the goose, Tom Edison. Just look at those eggs. Just look at your pants.
Poor Tom. He was all egg. He was only 4, but he was much too heavy to sit on an egg. He was only 4, and he was very disappointed. That was Tom Edison's first experiment, and it was a failure. In 1854, the Edisons moved away from Milan, Ohio. They went by train and boat to the town of Port Huron, Michigan. There, Tom started school. The schoolmaster, Mr. Engel, had a terrible temper. He didn't like children very much, and most of all, he didn't like Tom Edison, who asked so many questions. One day, Mr. Engel lost his temper.
"Tom Edison, all you do is ask silly questions. There is nothing I can do with you. Your brains are addled."
When Mrs. Edison heard what the schoolmaster had said, she was angry. Addled? Weak in the head? Ha! Not her son. But she could not say as much for Mr. Engel. Mrs. Edison took Tom out of school. She would teach him herself. Tom never went back to school. In all his life, Thomas Edison spent only 3 months in school. Tom spent only 3 months in school, but he was a great reader. He read all kinds of books. When Tom was 9, he read a science book. It told about electricity. Electricity. Oh, how Tom loved that word. This book changed Tom's life. He decided to become an inventor. Tom needed money for his experiments. He needed money for more science books. So when he was only 12, Tom went to work. He had to leave his home in Port Huron at 7 o'clock every morning, and he did not get home again until long after dark. Tom sold newspapers on a train. Oh, he also sold sandwiches and apples, peanuts and candy. Tom made money on the train, but he needed still more money for his experiments and books. What could he do to make more money? Tom thought about this for some time. Then he had an idea. He would put out his own newspaper. He would write it and print it and sell it. Oh, but where could he work? There was plenty of room in the baggage car on the train. Tom bought an old printing press and put it in the baggage car, and he started to work, writing, printing, and selling copies of his own paper. Tom didn't spell very well. Sometimes he forgot to put periods at the end of his sentences, and so they ran on and on and on. But people bought his paper. They liked the stories, and Tom's spelling made them laugh. Now, Tom made more money, but he had one more problem. He had the money for his experiments, but he didn't have the time. All day long and far into the night he was on the train. He was much too tired by the time he got home to work on his experiments so late at night. Tom solved this problem too. He moved his glass jars and his chemicals. He moved his whole laboratory into the baggage car. Now Tom could do his experiments while he was on the train. One morning, Tom was late getting to the station. The train was already pulling out. Tom ran very fast and grabbed hold of the back of the train. But his arms were full of bundles and he could hold on with only one hand. The train clicked and clacked as it went faster and faster. Tom was slipping. A man on the train reached down and grabbed Tom. He grabbed the first thing he could get hold of. He grabbed Tom's ears and pulled Tom up to safety. Tom Edison felt something go snap inside his head. Very soon he was quite deaf. Oh, he could hear people shout, he could hear the roar of a train, but all the soft sounds of the world were lost to him. Tom tried not to mind. He taught himself to read other people's lips, and he said the silence gave him room to think. Oh, but years later he wrote in his diary that he had not heard a bird sing since he was 12 years old. For 3 more years, Tom continued to work on the train, and then one day the train pulled into the station where his friend Mr. Mackenzie worked as a telegraph operator. Tom hopped off quickly and ran into the telegraph office. He liked to watch Mr. Mackenzie work. Tom loved the mysterious telegraph machinery. As he stood in the office, he looked through the window. What he saw made him rush out. Little Jimmy, Mr. Mackenzie's son, was playing on the tracks, and a train was coming. Tom took a flying leap right in front of the train. He grabbed the little boy and they rolled to safety. Tom felt his heel bang against the side of the train. It was that close. Mr. Mackenzie's voice shook.
What can I ever do to repay you, Tom?
Tom looked toward the telegraph office. Mr. Mackenzie understood. He would teach Tom the secrets of the telegraph. Tom studied hard. 5 months later, a proud boy shook hands with Mr. Mackenzie. Tom was only 16 years old, but now he could do a man's job. Now he could join the men who wandered from town to town, men who called themselves telegraph operators. For 5 years, Tom wandered, from Ohio to Missouri to Alabama, from Mississippi to the Carolinas, and then back home again. During those years of work, he did a lot of dreaming. Ideas began to grow. Then when Tom was 21, he went to New York City, where he worked for men who owned big machines, new machines that ran by electricity. Tom was very good at inventing ways to make these machines better. He began to make money. In a couple years, he had enough money that he could stop working for other men. Tom built himself what he called an invention factory. It was on a piece of land in New Jersey called Menlo Park. He hired other men to work with him and help make his ideas and dreams come true. One of his first important inventions was this phonograph machine.
Hello, hello! Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was should go.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was should go.
As you can see, nothing about that phonograph machine looked much like our record players of today. Later, Tom improved it. He put a big horn on it to make the sound better, and he made a better record, too. It was round and flat, just as the ones of today are. Now, this is a picture of the first electric light, the one invented by Tom Edison. Today, we have many kinds of light bulbs for many different uses, but they all began with this first electric light. The first movie camera was another of Edison's inventions. It was a very heavy machine, and today they're light enough that you can carry many of them and even take movies at home. I wonder, would Tom Edison recognize some of his own inventions if he were to see them today? Oh, he was a man with so many dreams for the future. I think he might. What I know for sure is this. His inventions made America a better and a brighter place for all of us to live. What you heard today about his life came from this book, The Story of Thomas Alva Edison, Inventor, by Mickey Compere. If you ever get the chance, I hope you will visit the Edison Museum in West Orange, New Jersey. There you can see and even touch many of his inventions. You'll see the notebooks in which he put his ideas. Why, he filled 3,400 notebooks. You can see the chair in which he sat and the coat he wore while he worked on his experiments. Oh, the next time you turn on a light or play a record, I hope you will think about this man who made all of that possible for you and all of us. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. Anything unusual about this old playing card? That's right. There are holes in it. And those holes were made by bullets. Wow! One would have to be a pretty good shot to be able to hit each one of the spots on such a card. Don't you agree? Well, there was a person who could do just that. A very famous entertainer in the history of our country. Would you be surprised if I told you that person was a woman? It's true. She was known as Annie Oakley. Annie became a very good shot when she was just a young girl. I think you might find her story interesting. It was the day before Thanksgiving. Annie Moses had followed her stepfather into the forest.
Please let me shoot your gun, Father.
Annie thought if she asked him often enough, he would let her shoot. Oh, but her stepfather answered,
Annie, shooting is a man's job.
Women used to shoot Indians right here in Ohio. Sometimes they had to when the men were away hunting.
Annie had learned that from her older sister. Oh, of course, there were no wild Indians in Ohio now. The year was 1867. At last, Annie's stepfather gave in.
All right, Annie. You win. You can shoot at the very next game bird we see. And when you miss, I'll try to hit it.
Annie's stepfather was a good man, but he did not think a girl belonged behind a gun. He decided to play a trick on Annie. He was sure the trick would cure her of wanting to shoot. He put some extra gunpowder in his gun. This would make the gun kick extra hard. Oh, he didn't want to hurt Annie, but he did want to make her afraid of a gun. Suddenly, they heard the gobble of a wild turkey. The big bird was just flying from the branch of a tree. Annie's stepfather handed her the gun.
Now's your chance, Annie.
Annie aimed carefully. When it felt right, she pulled the trigger. The gun roared. Oh, it was louder than usual because of the extra powder, and Annie called out,
Ouch!
The kick was much worse than her stepfather thought it would be. The butt of the gun had slammed into Annie's shoulder.
Oh, Annie, dear, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just meant to scare you a little.
Annie held back her tears.
I'm not sorry. I'm glad. Just look.
Annie pointed to the turkey that was lying on the ground. She had shot it neatly in the head.
Hooray! We're going to have a turkey for Thanksgiving.
You're a good shot, Annie. I'm proud of you.
The country near Greenville, Ohio, where Annie lived, was wild and beautiful. Oh, she loved to walk through the woods and the fields. But Annie did not have much time for play. She helped her mother with the housework, and she helped take care of her little brother and sister and the baby. One day, Annie's stepfather became sick. After a short time, he died. Oh, that was a sad day for Annie and her family. And after that, Annie's mother had very little money for food for the children. To help out, Annie went to work for a farmer. She rode in the farmer's wagon to his house. The farmer's wife met her at the front gate.
I'd hoped we were going to get a bigger girl. You're going to have to work mighty hard.
I'm willing to work hard.
Oh, but Annie did not know what the woman meant by hard work. Why, the farmer's wife made Annie get up at 4 o'clock every morning to milk the cows and feed the pigs and the chickens. Then she had to cook the breakfast. Next, Annie pumped water and washed the dishes and dressed the baby. Then the woman made her sweep the house and scrub the floor. Well, Annie never had any time to rest or play. And the farmer's wife would not even let her go to school. However, Annie did learn to ride a horse. She rode horseback when she brought the cows in from the field to the barn. The only reason the farmer let Annie ride was because it saved time. That meant more time for her to do other chores. Annie thought riding was fun. But that was all the fun she had. Sometimes Annie was so tired that she almost fell asleep while working. Then she remembered that the farmer was sending money to her mother, and to herself she would say,
I must stay awake. Mother needs the money.
One night, Annie heard the farmer talking to his wife.
Annie is the biggest bargain we've ever had.
Aren't you sending money to her mother?
Oh, of course not. Annie just thinks I'm sending it. I wrote her mother and said I could not pay Annie any money. But I told her Annie is happy with us and is going to school. Her mother wrote back that Annie could stay.
You're a smart man. We must not let Annie know her mother isn't getting any money.
Oh, Annie was angry. To think that she had worked so hard for nothing. She was afraid to say anything to the farmer or his wife. They would probably treat her even worse. That night, when Annie went to bed, she started to cry. But she soon fought back the tears.
I must not cry. I must plan to escape.
Before she went to sleep, Annie had made a plan. The next night, Annie went to bed with all her clothes on. She lay there quietly until she heard the farmer and his wife snoring. Then she stuffed her pillow and a blanket under the bed covers. But if the farmer's wife looked in, she would think Annie was asleep in bed. Annie tied her few belongings into a bundle and started to tiptoe down the stairs. One of the stairs creaked. Annie heard the farmer's wife ask,
"What was that noise?"
Annie froze in her tracks. Her heart seemed to beat as loudly as a drum. Oh, surely they would hear it. But the farmer grumbled,
"Oh, that was just a mouse. Go back to sleep."
Annie could not help smiling. To herself, she whispered,
I'm a pretty big mouse. Now I must be quiet as a mouse.
Annie waited for the farmer and his wife to get back to sleep. Then she crept down the stairs and out of the house. When she reached the road, she started to run. There was a railroad station nearby. Annie planned to take the first train, no matter where it went. Well, luckily, the first train went to a place near Annie's home. She climbed aboard. Annie's mother was very happy to see her girl. Oh, but the family still needed money, and Annie still wanted to help out in some way. She started hunting again. She shot birds, rabbits, and squirrels for her family to eat. That way her mother did not have to buy any meat, and this saved money that could be used for other things. One day, Mr. Katzenberger, who ran the general store, told Annie,
I know a man who runs a hotel. He likes to serve quail in his dining room. He'll pay good money for your quail.
Why, that's wonderful. I can shoot all the quail he can use.
The money that Annie earned from the hotel man was a big help to her family. She even earned enough to save some for herself. When she was 16, she had saved enough money that she could take a trip to visit her older sister who lived in Cincinnati. While Annie was in Cincinnati, she met a young man who did trick shooting in a theater. His name was Frank Butler. Frank was very impressed with Annie, and within a year the two were married. Annie became part of Frank's act on the stage. Now, she needed a stage name. She and Frank finally picked the name of Oakley. They liked the way Annie Oakley sounded. Annie and Frank became a very popular team. Crowds paid big money to watch the two do their trick shooting. Now, at this time, one of the most famous buffalo hunters in America was a man named William Cody. He was called Buffalo Bill. He started a Wild West show. He wanted people in the eastern part of America to see what the West was really like. The people who came to his show saw wild buffalo, deer, elk, and bear. They saw Indians wearing bonnets that had feathers trailing to the ground. The show had cowboys who rode bucking horses. There were make-believe bandits who robbed a stagecoach. The show also had some men who were good shooters. Buffalo Bill met Annie and Frank. Oh, Annie was so small that Buffalo Bill did not believe she could shoot. When she showed him how good she was with a gun, he changed his mind
and even asked her to join his show. So, with Frank as her manager, Annie joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Oh, everybody liked Annie's act. She rode into the arena on a snow-white horse. She wore a buckskin skirt and shirt. Her hair swung below her big cowboy hat. Her blue eyes shone with pleasure. Frank threw some glass balls into the air. Annie raised her gun. Crack! With each shot, Annie broke a glass ball. Then Annie got off her horse, and Frank held a coin between his thumb and finger. Annie shot the coin out of his fingers. Next, Frank held up a playing card. Annie shot the spots out of it. Oh, the Wild West show went to many cities. It even traveled across the ocean to the countries of Europe. Why, one time Annie performed for the Queen of England, and another time for the Kaiser of Germany. While she was in Germany, Prince William, the Kaiser's grandson, walked up to Annie.
Miss Oakley, in London you shot the ashes off a cigarette. It was held in your helper's mouth.
That's right.
I would like you to do that trick here, and I will be your helper.
What could Annie do? She hated to refuse the prince, but what if she missed the cigarette and hit the prince in the head? Before she could think of an excuse, the prince lit a cigarette and held it between his lips. Annie swung her gun to her shoulder and took careful aim. Then she pulled the trigger. The ashes on the prince's cigarette fell to the ground. Once Annie was in the famous city of Vienna, Austria. A rich baroness who lived there asked Annie if she would put on a show to help raise money for some orphans. Annie was glad to help. Her show was a big success and raised a lot of money. To thank her, the baroness sent her a bag full of gold coins. Annie gave the gold coins to the orphans. When the baroness heard about Annie's gift to the orphans, she sent Annie a beautiful diamond pin. Oh, the pin sparkled like a star, like the shooting star that Annie had become. Our story today came from this book, Annie Oakley, The Shooting Star by Charles Graves. She was quite a gal. It would have been fun to see her perform. I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. In this picture does not look much like the ones that we're used to seeing today, does it? And for a very good reason. It was made over 70 years ago. The factory in Detroit, Michigan that made this card belonged to a man by the name of Henry Ford.
How did Henry Ford come to make cars for the people of America? I think we should find out. 12-year-old Henry Ford called...
Dad, stop the horses. Look what's coming. A steam engine.
Mr. Ford brought the wagon to a stop. Henry jumped off the seat and ran ahead. He had seen engines at the railroad station in the city, but never before on a road here in Dearborn. The driver stopped the engine so that Henry could see it. He said,
"This is used to run machinery on some of the farms."
Henry asked many questions because he wanted to know all about the engine. The driver told Mr. Ford,
"That's a bright boy you have there. He should make a good farmer."
Mr. Ford shook his head sadly.
Henry can fix tools and almost anything else, but he doesn't like farm work.
If we had an engine, I would.
Then and there, Henry had a dream, but he did not tell his father. He would make a smaller engine so farmers could use it in place of horses. His engine would pull wagons and make farm work easier. And best of all, it would move a carriage faster than any horse could. When Henry was through with high school, Mr. Ford wanted him to stay on the farm. Oh, but Henry said,
"Farm life is not for me. I'm going to the city. I'll work in a machine shop where I can learn more about tools and engines. You can't make engines on a farm."
He had not forgotten his dream of making an engine that would pull a carriage. The city of Detroit was not far from Dearborn. There, Henry found work in a machine shop. Every day, Henry worked hard at the shop, learning all he could about engines. One day, he read about a new engine. It burned gasoline, and it was not as large as a steam engine. Henry thought he could make one too. Maybe it could pull a carriage. Was this the answer to his dream? He visited his father in Dearborn and told him his plans. Mr. Ford said,
"That would be a fine thing for farmers. Why don't you stay here and build your engine?"
And so Henry stayed. Every day he'd cut wood, milk the cows, and helped his father. At night, he worked on his engine, making most of the parts himself. When he was not working, Henry liked to be with girls like Clara Barton. She lived on a nearby farm. Clara and Henry grew to love each other, and at last she became his wife. One day, Henry asked Clara,
"How would you like to move to Detroit? I'll get a daytime job and work on my engine and carriage at night."
Anything you want to do is all right with me, Henry.
Other men were making engines now too, but they were too large. Henry wanted his engine to be small. A little engine would be cheap to make, and it would fit onto a carriage. Henry told Clara,
"Horses won't always be needed to pull carriages or wagons. If I can make an engine that doesn't cost much, everyone can buy one."
Why, then everyone will have a horseless carriage.
Clara thought that Henry was very smart. Oh, but some people called him Crazy Ford. They said his horseless carriage would never work. At last, Henry's engine was ready. His car was really like an open carriage with 4 large wheels. The gasoline engine that Henry had made was under the seat. He started the engine, climbed onto the seat, and off he went. The car really ran. Crazy Ford, ha! His horseless carriage worked, and his dream was real. Of course, there is a lot more to know about Henry Ford and about the cars that came after that first one. So perhaps you will want to read this book, Henry Ford, by Adrian Paradis. When it became possible for families to buy a car, imagine the excitement of taking the very first ride in such an automobile. We're going to visit the Walker family on the day that they get the second car in town. Ellen Walker looked at the clock. Too early for dinner. She tried to read her book. Too excited to read, because today was the day. After dinner, the automobile was coming. the second car in town. Dr. Payson had the first automobile. It was black and shiny. Dr. Payson had no children, just Mrs. Payson, and she did not like children. So no children rode in Dr. Payson's car. Mr. Walker's car would welcome children, Ellen, Kate, Fred, and their friends. Ellen went to the stairs. She heard the clatter of dishes. Down she ran to the dining room. Their mother was putting dinner on the table. But Ellen was not hungry. Her father asked,
"Too excited to eat? You're missing the finest dinner in all Hancock County."
After dinner, Ellen went back to her room. She put her duster on over her dress. It would keep off the dust when she rode in the automobile. Ellen put on her hat and tied it under her chin. The hat would keep her hair in place when she rode in the automobile. Ellen looked in the mirror. She was ready to go. Outside, she heard a sound. It was the horn of the second car in town. Ellen raced out the door to the street. She beat Kate, she beat Fred, she beat their father, but their mother beat Ellen. The automobile salesman showed Ellen's father how to start the car. He showed Ellen's brother Fred how to stop the car. Mrs. Walker climbed up onto the high back seat. Kate climbed up onto the high jump seat. She called down to Ellen.
"Why, I feel like a princess."
Ellen walked around the car. She saw the gleaming headlights. She saw the horn. She saw the wide running board. Her mother called,
"Ellen, come up with me."
Mrs. Walker opened one of the little doors to the back seat.
"Isn't this fun?"
The yard was filling with friends and relatives. Mr. Hooper from next door said,
"Mr. Walker, that is a handsome automobile."
"Well, thank you. We'll take the children for a ride."
Fred's friends climbed onto the running board. Kate's friends crowded onto the jump seat. Ellen's best friend, Jean, sat beside her. As Ellen spread the duster over Jean's skirt, she whispered,
"I feel like a queen."
Mr. Walker started the automobile. The car salesman sat beside him. They putt-putted up the hill and headed out of town toward the country. The automobile tore along the road at 20 miles an hour. Ellen hung on to her hat. Mrs. Walker hung on to Ellen. She called to her husband,
"Careful, Will."
Fred grinned at his sisters.
"Slick. We're going like greased lightning."
A horse reared up, a cow mooed, some hens clucked as the car sped by. They got to Mr. Sawyer's farm. Mr. Sawyer stood by his mailbox. Mrs. Sawyer stood beside him, and their 3 grown-up sons leaned on the fence. Mr. Sawyer muttered,
"Oh, some contraption."
In the road was a big mud puddle. In the puddle was Mr. Sawyer's pig. She was taking a mud bath. Mr. Walker slowed up so the red car would not hit the pig. But the car salesman said,
"Speed up, or we'll get stuck."
It was too late. The auto motor sputtered and stopped. The car salesman shook his head in disgust. Mr. Walker looked at the pig. Then he looked at Mr. Sawyer. Mr. Sawyer said,
"Pig was there first."
Mr. Walker nodded. The pig liked her bath. She rubbed herself all over in the mud. The children started to giggle, but the car salesman looked cross. He jumped out of the car. Whoops! His feet slipped out from under him and he landed right in the mud puddle. He got to his feet and sloshed through the water to the front of the automobile. Angrily, he turned the crank. The motor coughed, but it did not start. He turned the crank again. Nothing happened. Everyone in the car kept still. The Sawyers smiled at one another, and Ellen heard Mr. Sawyer say,
"Yep, the darn pig was there first."
The car salesman turned the crank once more. The motor sputtered and caught on. The pig looked at the car in a surprised way and waddled over to Mrs. Sawyer. The car salesman hopped back into the front seat. His clothes were dripping wet.
To Mr. Walker, he said,
Pull the throttle. Not too hard, but hard enough to get us out of here.
Mr. Walker pulled the throttle. Not too hard, but hard enough to get the automobile out of the puddle. Mr. Walker honked the horn. The children cheered. They waved at the Sawyer family, and the Sawyers waved back. Fred shouted,
Give her all she's got, Pa.
Mr. Walker raced the car back toward town. At 1 Mile Corner, Tubby Brown was waiting with his fish cart. He looked as if he might fall right off the cart.
Land sakes, what tarnation is that?
Fred called,
Look out for the fastest car on the road.
Tubby shook his head.
Beats all.
The automobile rushed past. Near Marsh Bridge, a boy was driving a prancing horse and an elegant buggy with a lady in the back seat. The boy looked back over his shoulder when he heard the car's horn honking politely, asking to get by. But he would not move over. With a touch of his whip, he urged his horse onward. Ellen saw her father's face redden. The automobile, which had slowed down, began to pick up speed as Mr. Walker urged it onward. Faster and faster went the car, past the lady who looked at the automobile with her mouth wide open, past the boy who was now whipping the horse with all his might, past the elegant horse who had never been passed before. Shaking her fist at the boy, Ellen yelled,
Put that whip down.
Kate was surprised.
Mother, did you hear Ellen yell?
Good for her. I never did take to people who hurt animals.
As they came to the village, Mr. Walker slowed down. With dignity, the automobile rolled down Main Street, red paint shining, brass gleaming. Mr. Walker told his passengers,
This afternoon, you young folk entered a new age in history. With automobiles of your own, you will go places and see sights we old folk never dreamed of.
And then Mr. Walker squeezed the horn, and they waved to the people watching on Main Street. And that was The Second Car in Town by Miriam Bourne. Wouldn't it have been fun to ride in one of those early automobiles? For today, goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. When I found this pretty Indian beadwork in a trunk and these moccasins, I was reminded of a story about a girl named Susanna. She and her family were pioneers on the prairies of South Dakota way back in the early 1900s. Their
first house was made of grass and dirt. Can you imagine? You see, the prairies were covered with tall, thick grass that grew in rich, dark soil. And the homesteaders, the people who tried to settle on government land on the prairie, cut blocks of this grass, or sod as it's called, from the ground to build walls. They would pile the blocks one on top of another. They even used sod to cover the roofs. Oh, but why do the moccasins and the beadwork remind me of Susanna's story? I think we should read Little Yellow Fur and find out. Susanna's mother warned her,
"Play close to the house. South Dakota is wild country, not like the town where we used to live."
Susanna was playing in front of their sod house. She and her mother and father were homesteaders. They had settled on free public land near the Rosebud Indian Reservation. Papa liked it here, but Mama was lonely so far from friends. Susanna thought the Indians might be their friends. They often rode by on their ponies, and they always waved to her. Often they stopped and talked to Papa. Now she heard the sound of horses coming. Young Indian men were riding them. Her mother ran out the door. She took Susanna's arm and pulled her into the house. Then Mama pushed the kitchen table against the door. She piled chairs on it to keep the Indians out. The men stopped their ponies in the yard. They whooped and laughed, and sometimes they sounded angry. Mama stood with her back pressed against the table. She was trembling. Susanna's heart beat fast. An Indian knocked at the door and shouted that he wanted a drink of water. Papa had told Susanna that some Indians knew a few English words. Papa could talk to them in Sioux language, but Mama could not. She called,
"There's a dipper at the windmill tank."
The Indian did not go away. Other young braves came to the door. They pushed on it. They laughed as if they knew Mama was afraid. Susanna went to the window. There, looking at her, were 3 Indian faces. The young braves waved. They spoke in their language, the language of the Sioux Indians. Susanna wished she knew what they said. She wished they could understand her.
Please, don't frighten Mama.
At last, the young Indians went to the windmill tank. Then some older Indians rode by and took the young men home with them. Soon Papa came from work in the far field. Mama told him about the Indians who pushed on the door. She added,
"I'm afraid to let Susanna play outside."
Don't worry. I know where I can buy a good watchdog.
The next day, Papa brought home a Great Dane dog. His name was Turk. Turk watched Susanna when she played in the yard. He taught her to stay in the yard. If she went toward the prairie or the creek, he growled. If Susanna did not come back, Turk went after her. He set his teeth in the hem of her dress and pulled her back to the yard. All summer, curious Indians stopped in the yard. The Indian women and children liked to look at Turk and Susanna. They called him Dog Big as a Pony. Turk let them come close to admire Susanna. The Indian women touched Susanna's blonde hair. Little Yellow Fur, they named her. They gave her chunks of brown sugar, calling it Chahumpiska. Susanna ate it and wanted more.
Chahumpiska?
The Indian women laughed when Susanna said the Sioux word for sugar. They clapped their hands and cried, "Hey-ya-hey!" Susanna knew this meant, "Wonderful, you're doing fine." She laughed with the Indians and said,
"Hey-ya-hey!"
Susanna's mother watched from the door of the house. She did not know what to do. The Indians liked Susanna too much, and Susanna liked them. They came almost every day to see her, and someday they might take Susanna home with them. An Indian woman went to Mama. She held out her own happy baby. Then she pointed to Susanna and said, "Trade?" Mama looked more frightened. All the Indian women laughed. Mama could not tell whether they really wanted to trade children or were only teasing her. The next summer, Susanna had a baby brother. He often slept outside in his carriage. Mama told Turk to watch him, too. The big dog tried to watch Susanna, but she played farther and farther from the house, and he could not go after her. He could not leave the baby alone. One day, Susanna crossed the prairie to the little creek. She picked flowers and she played under the wild cherry trees. Oh, like Papa, she loved this wild country. It was almost dark when she heard her mother calling. She ran home. Papa was there. Mama was almost crying. With his arm around Susanna, Papa said,
"There, the Indians didn't take her."
Susanna gave Mama a bouquet. Her mother smiled and kissed Susanna, but she said to Papa,
"I have reason to worry. I'm alone here all day with the children. I know the Indians don't want us here on land that used to be theirs. The young men came to the tank again today. They talked loud and angrily."
I'll speak to Red Cloud. He's a friend of mine. He'll ask his braves to behave.
The next day, Susanna saw Papa and Red Cloud talking together. Red Cloud was a leader of the Sioux. Red Cloud's eyes were sad. Susanna knew why. Papa had told her. Red Cloud had fought at the Battle of Wounded Knee 25 years before. His wife and children were killed in the fight with the soldiers. The Sioux still called it the Battle of the 100 Slain. They could not forget. And so many settlers were still afraid of Red Cloud and the other Sioux. Now Susanna heard Red Cloud tell Papa why the young men were angry.
In the buffalo days, we were happy here in our own country. The prairie was full of four-legged game. The young men hunted, and we were never hungry unless the winter was long and the snow deep. Then the white man came. These settlers told us they wanted only a little land, enough to set a house on, but they kept coming like a river. They filled the prairie. Their guns drove the buffalo far away. Now our young men have little to hunt, nothing to do. We must live on a reservation in a little pen. Our eyes run with tears. So our young men race their ponies, and they laugh when they frighten the white settlers.
Then Red Cloud rode away. One afternoon, Susanna went to the creek again. She walked far along the banks, picking wild cherries. She heard a sound behind her and turned. Oh, she was looking right into the face of an old Indian. She knew that wise face. It was Red Cloud. Indian women and children laughed, happy to see Susanna. They invited her to go with them to their village. Susanna went. It was a long walk, so Red Cloud carried her on his shoulders. At last he set her down in a circle of teepees. Women bent over outdoor cook fires. They turned roasts of rabbit and prairie hen. The meat smelled good, and Susanna was hungry. The women gave her bits of roast hen. Indian boys and girls gathered around and ate with Susanna. After supper, the boys showed her their small bows and arrows, and one boy said,
"We must shoot well, like our fathers. We must grow up to be good hunters and bring home meat to feed our people."
An older boy leaped on his pony. He shot an arrow straight through the heart of a cactus plant. His friends cried, "Hey, hey!" Susanna clapped and smiled. Oh, he would be a good hunter. The girls showed Susanna beautiful dresses and moccasins that they wore on special feast days. The women and girls had worked picture designs on the soft animal skins. They used dyed porcupine quills and tiny colored beads. Susanna put her feet into a pair of moccasins much too big for her. The women laughed.
They promised to make moccasins to fit her and a Sioux dress of doeskin. The cook fires burned low, the sun went down. Susanna was sleepy. Oh, but she didn't want to go into a dark teepee. She wanted to go home, but the prairie was dark and she didn't know which way to go. Red Cloud spoke up.
Come, little yellow fur.
His spotted pony stood behind him. Susanna hoped he was going to take her home. Just then a dog barked. It sounded like Turk. Yes, Turk found her and barked with joy. Then Papa came on his horse. Red Cloud lifted Susanna and put her on the saddle behind her father. Her father spoke to Red Cloud.
I'm sorry if Susanna was any trouble.
Red Cloud spoke in the Sioux language. As they were riding home, Susanna asked,
"What did Red Cloud say?"
Red Cloud wants you to come again. He said, in a Sioux village, every door is open to a child. Every pot has food for a hungry boy or girl. Every heart loves children.
Susanna felt happy.
Red Cloud is my friend, and the Indian women are going to make me a Sioux dress. Moccasins, too.
The next day, the Indian women came to Susanna's yard. They asked her to stand beside several Indian girls. They found one just Susanna's size. Now they knew how big to make the dress. After 7 days, the Indian women came back. Oh, but this time they didn't stop in the yard. They knocked on the door. Mama opened it and stood in the doorway. She had never invited an Indian into her home. The women smiled and held out a dress and moccasins. At last, Mama seemed to see that they would not hurt Susanna.
Come in. Welcome.
2 grandmothers helped Susanna put on the Sioux dress and moccasins. Susanna turned round and round.
I feel like a Sioux princess.
The women clapped their hands and cried, "Hey, hey!" Susanna smiled and said,
"Hey, hey! Thank you, thank you."
Yes, thank you. Your bead and quill work is beautiful.
Then Mama smiled. She clapped her hands as the Indian women did.
Hey, hey!
Susanna was happy, for now Mama knew that the Indians were their friends. And that was Little Yellow Fur by Wilma Pitchford Hayes. In the story, the author tells about things that really happened to her as a child. She was Little Yellow Fur. For today, goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education. Hi. Look at this old teddy bear I found. Do you know why toy bears are called Teddy? They were named for a very important man, Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, as he was often called. In the year 1902, a picture was taken of Teddy Roosevelt holding a little cub bear whose life he had saved while he was on a hunting trip. And because he was so famous, many people saw the picture, and soon toy makers began making little stuffed bears that they called teddy bears. Today we're going to learn something about this man, Theodore Roosevelt. His son, Quentin, would like to tell you the story.
I'm Quentin, and here's my brother Archie, and here's Father. There's just one thing bad about Father. He's President of the United States. That means he has to live in the White House. And all the rest of us, Mother, Alice, Ted, Kermit, Ethel, Archie, and me, we all have to live there too. There's one thing Archie and I can't understand about Father. I mean, Father could have been a boxer or a wrestler. He can even do jiu-jitsu. Mother says he could have headed the police force in New York City forever if he had wanted to. Our brother Ted says Father could have kept on being a cowboy on his ranch in the West. Father could have been general. Our sister Alice says Father was a brave soldier and helped win a war in Cuba. And Father could have been a hunter. Our brother Kermit says Father knows how to catch wildcats and bears. Now, if Father can do all these things, what Archie and I would like to know is how come he'd rather be president? Being president can practically ruin your whole life. Presidents have to shake hands with congressmen. They have to tell jokes to policemen. They have to make a lot of speeches. And they have to have dinner with lots of foreign princes. Archie and I don't get to see half enough of Father. Father feels pretty bad about it, too. He lets us come to his office every afternoon at 4, and for an hour or so, he does whatever we want him to do. Sometimes Father draws a map for us with his umbrella and tells us all about the war. He shows us where the Russians and the Japanese are fighting each other. Then we play that Archie is Russian and I am Japanese. I always get to win because the Japanese are beating the Russians. That's what Father says. He's trying to get them to stop fighting. Sometimes we visit our blue parrot, Eli Yale. Sometimes when Father rides his horse, he lets Archie and me take turns riding our pony, Algonquin. Algonquin has a soft nose. Charlie Lee takes care of him. Sometimes we visit our other pets. We say hello to our white guinea pigs, to our hens, and to Josiah, the badger. Father brought Josiah home from one of his hunting trips. Josiah likes milk and potatoes. Sometimes we feed the dogs, Cuba and Skip and Jack and the sailor boy. And that's all the pets we have. Oh, except for 2 rats, the turtle, a flying squirrel, and a kitten. We like to have Father around, but Mother says we have to let Father have a few hours to himself every day, or he will never be able to run the country. So Archie and I find stuff to do. But when you live in the White House, you have to be careful. Things don't really belong to you. Nearly everything is government property. Suppose you're having a race in the hall with your dog. Suppose your hand goes through a picture. It's Mrs. Benjamin Harrison, wife of the 23rd president, and that picture is government property. And nobody likes it when you slide downstairs on tin trays. Father shouts.
By Godfrey, don't you bunnies know how dangerous that could be? Suppose some senator got hurt.
Suppose you and Archie are having a stilt race on the lawn, and you happen to run through a flower bed. Here come the Secret Service men and the White House police. You have to get right out of that flower bed. It's government property, too. If Father catches you putting spitballs on Andrew Jackson's picture, he gets mad. Andrew Jackson was the 7th president. He's government property, too. You can't even visit your brother when he's sick. When Archie had the measles, he was upstairs in his bedroom. He hadn't seen Algonquin for weeks. So I went to Charlie Lee, and we sneaked Algonquin into the basement, past the White House police. We rang for the freight elevator, then we all got on. Charlie Lee and I had to push Algonquin. We all went upstairs and had a long visit with Archie. It cheered him up a lot, but the minute Father found out, he sent Algonquin right back to the stable.
By Godfrey Quentin, how can you be such a muttonhead? It's preposterous. You know perfectly well you can't bring a pony into the White House on the freight elevator. It's government property.
Archie and I have much more fun in the summer at our house at Oyster Bay. Nothing is government property there. Our big brothers, Ted and Kermit, are home from school. Sometimes our big sister, Alice, is there too. Alice loves to speed. She races her car along at 25 miles an hour. Alice has her picture in the paper practically every day. Someone once asked Father why he didn't do something about Alice. Father said,
I can do one of two things. I can be President of the United States, or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both.
This summer, Archie and I are helping Father run things. This way, we may get to see more of Father. If the Russians and the Japanese would quit fighting, Father would be pleased as punch, and so would we. Father sent a telegram to Russia, asking them to stop fighting. He sent another telegram to Japan, asking them to stop fighting too. Soon after that, a big ship came to Oyster Bay. 2 Russians got off. They wanted to see Father about ending the war. Archie and I were waiting for them on the dock. We pretended we were fishing, but we were watching every move they made. And we reported their arrival to Father. We knew some Japanese gentlemen were coming too. So Archie and I hung around town and hitched a ride home with them. Then we reported their arrival to Father. The peace talks are coming along quite nicely, thanks to Archie and me. But Archie and Father and I don't have to work every day trying to end the war. Sometimes we take a day off and play. We put our bathing suits on and go down to the float. We play a game called Stagecoach. And here's how it goes. Mother is the driver, Father is a horse. I'm the whip, Archie is the guard, Cousin Nick is the wildcat, Ethel is the old lady passenger, Cousin Lorraine is the left rear wheel. Then Father starts telling the story. And when he says your name, you have to jump into the water. And when he says Stagecoach, just watch what happens.
All right, everybody, here goes. We're traveling along at a fast clip. The driver is cracking the whip when all at once the old lady passenger calls to the guard, she's seen a wildcat. The horse rears up when he sees the wildcat, and the left rear wheel is smashed. Then over the cliff crashes the stagecoach.
And when Father says Stagecoach, every one of us is in the water. Sometimes Father goes camping overnight with Ted and Kermit. When Archie and I are bigger, Father says we can go too. Father knows where the raccoons live. He knows the songs of all the birds and the names of all the flowers. The Russians and the Japanese came back again. Father asked them to shake hands, and they sailed away to make peace. Archie and I were in the Father's study when suddenly the telephone rang.
What's that?
Then Father called to Mother.
Edie, They've made peace. The war is over. A mighty good thing for Russia, and a mighty good thing for Japan, and a mighty good thing for us, too.
So all afternoon, Father and Archie and I have been opening telegrams from kings and emperors and people all over the world. They're all saying thank you to Father for stopping the war. Well, the war's over. Summer's over, too. Ted and Kermit have gone back to school. Mother and Ethel and Archie and I are back in the White House with Father. Mother says Father is planning to go to Panama to build a canal. Archie and I are waiting for Father to come in and play with us before we go to sleep. Sometimes we play that Father is the hunter, and we're bears. Father tries to paw us out from under our beds. Sometimes he reads us a poem. One of his favorites is,
Billiken, Williken, Winky, Wee, how does the president take his tea? He takes it in bed, he takes it in school, he takes it in Congress against the rule. He takes it with brandy and thinks it no sin. Oh, Punky Doodle and Jollopin.
Then Father tosses me on top of Archie, and he tickles both of us. And then bang, I hit Father with a pillow, and plop, Archie hits him with another, and a first-rate pillow fight begins. Mother comes in dressed for dinner.
Theodore, we will be late if we don't go down at once.
Why, Edie, Quentin here and Archie and I.
Theodore, you've rumpled your shirt. You'll have to change it.
Then Mother and Father kiss us goodnight and turn out the lights. Archie and I get under the covers, and we talk about what we're going to be when we grow up. Archie says maybe he will be a general, or a cowboy, or a policeman, but not me. I've thought it over. When I grow up, I'd like to be a plain man with bunnies like Father.
And that was The One Bad Thing About Father by F.N. Mongeau. Teddy Roosevelt is just one of many, many Americans who helped to make this country what it is today. The United States is one of the strongest, most powerful countries in the world. Oh, but more important, it's a wonderful and exciting place to live. I hope the stories we've shared have helped you to understand your country. And I hope you will go right on your own, finding books to help you learn even more about the United States of America. Goodbye.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Ohio Department of Education.